on Sunday morning, while it was still dark, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb and found that the stone had been rolled away from the entrance. She ran and found Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved. She said, "They have taken the Lord's body out of the tomb, and we have already killed him." Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb. They were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter, reached the tomb first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings lying there, while the cloth that had covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw and believed. For until then, they still hadn't understood the scriptures that said Jesus must rise from the dead. Then they went home. Mary was standing outside the tomb crying. And as she wept, she stooped and looked in. She saw two white-robed angels, one sitting at the head and the other at the foot of the place where the body of Jesus had been lying. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" the angels asked her.
"Because they have taken away my Lord, and I don't know where they have put him."
She turned to leave and saw someone standing there. It was Jesus, but she didn't recognize him. "Dear woman, why are you crying?" Jesus asked her. "Who are you looking for?" She thought he was the gardener.
"Sir, if you have taken him away, tell me where you have put him, and I will go and get him."
"Mary," Jesus said. She turned to him and cried out,
"Rabboni,"
which is Hebrew for teacher. "Don't cling to me," Jesus said, "for I haven't yet ascended to the Father. But go find my brothers and tell them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God." Mary Magdalene found the disciples, told them,
"I've seen the Lord."
Then she gave them his message. Well, on Easter, I kind of hate to go back to Good Friday, but the context is important. See, I think it would probably be difficult to overstate the depths to which the disciples' spirits must have fallen after the crucifixion. You see, 3 years earlier, they had given up everything to follow Jesus of Nazareth. And now, he had been sentenced to death, killed. And not only was he dead, but the disciples now lived in fear that they would be killed as well. And so they had no bright future left. And if that was not enough, as Easter Sunday dawned, they also felt a heavy sense of guilt. For all of them had abandoned Jesus just as he needed them most. And so they knew, and maybe worse, everyone else knew, the truth about them. That they were just cowards. You see, for Jesus' disciples, their hopes, their dreams, even to some extent their faith, had been crucified with Jesus. And they must have sunk into utter despair. In fact, the scriptures record that after the crucifixion, as that day dawned on that Sunday, They were all in hiding, behind locked doors, paralyzed by fear. And my guess is that we've all faced days similar to that, maybe not that extent, but a day or days when the world or circumstances, for whatever reason, seem so dark to us that hope seemed difficult for us to find. Well, we Haneys, I'm a Haney, had a saying that we put on the wall of a parsonage in Wisconsin when we lived there. And I want to share that saying with you. The saying was, life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass. It's learning to dance in the rain. Now, I'd like you to consider that a moment. Life isn't about waiting for the storm to pass. It's learning to dance in the rain. And so my question is, how do we do that? How do we dance in the rain? Well, the only sure way is we first have to peer inside that tomb. We have to come to that Sunday 2,000 years ago and look inside that tomb and come to a decision regarding it. The Apostle Paul records what actually happened on that day and the days following, and I want to share it with you this morning. It's recorded in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, if you ever want to take a look. He writes this: He was raised from the dead on the third day, just as the Scriptures said. He was seen by Peter, and then by the 12. After that, he was seen by more than 500 of his followers at one time. And he says, most of whom are still alive when he wrote that, though some have died. Then he was seen by James, and later by all the apostles. And he ends this by saying, last of all, as though I had been born at the wrong time, I also saw him. I mean, can you imagine that sight? What I'd like you to do this morning is just imagine for a moment that one of your friends or a family member who you saw die and who was readied for burial by the local funeral home and buried in the cemetery. And then you see that same person, days after they have died, alive. And you not only see them, but you talk with them. And you eat with them. You see, that's what they experienced. That was Easter. And it kind of reminds me of a humorous story I once read. See, it seems a gentleman worked on the 4 p.m. to midnight shift, so pretty late shift, late at night, and he always walked home after work. Well, one night the moon was shining so bright that he decided to take a shortcut through the cemetery. Yeah. You know something's up at that point. And that would save him roughly a half-mile walk to his walk. Well, there were no incidents involved, so he repeated the process on a regular basis, always following the same path. Well, one night as he was walking his route through the cemetery, he did not realize that during the day, a grave had been dug in the very center of his path. And he stepped right into it. And he immediately started trying to get out. Well, his best efforts failed. And so after a few minutes, he decided to relax, wait till morning, when someone would help him out. And so he sat down in the corner of this grave and was half asleep when a man who had had too much to drink stumbled into the grave. Well, his arrival roused the shift worker, since the man who had had too much to drink was desperately trying to climb out. And so the shift worker reached out his hand, he touched the man on the leg, and said, "Friend, you can't get out of here." But you see, he did. You see, I bet that man came away from that experience a changed man, you know. You see, what we need to understand is the resurrection event was designed for us, not God. God already knew what he could do with a lifeless lump of clay, how he could again breathe life into it. But you see, the empty tomb was meant to change us. It was meant to change us. Easter was for us. And what's more, there's no doubt that the disciples were transformed by that experience, by Jesus' resurrection from the dead. You see, what we see in the events following the resurrection of Jesus Christ is that the disciples still face difficult days. They didn't escape tough times. And so we shouldn't expect to escape tough times either. They were arrested again and again. They were thrown into prison. All but one of them were put to death precisely because of their testimony. You see, they still had plenty of days that could have led to despair. But you see, they had seen the empty tomb. And they had seen Jesus risen from the dead. And so as a result of that truth, they would never again dwell in those dark places of the Spirit. No more would they feel the despair that they felt before they had seen their risen Lord. You see, because of that truth, they instead face life with a new hope and a new confidence. You see, the resurrection of Christ, like his crucifixion, is a message from God, speaking a profound truth that changes everything for us. And I want you to understand that it changes everything for you. And these events define the very lives of the earliest disciples. Jesus' resurrection vindicated everything Jesus said. Everything Jesus did, and everything Jesus was and is. And ultimately, the resurrection is the dramatic sign of God's victory over all the forces that conspired against Jesus and us. It signals that sin and death and evil will not have the final word, though they may appear for a time to have the upper hand. See, the resurrection is a shout of victory over all these things. Proof that goodness and life will ultimately prevail. And you see, all of what I've told you so far has been, and the resurrection of the dead from, Jesus, can all be summed up in just one word that can define our lives from now on. And that word is hope. You see, hope is the sense that things will work out. That despite difficult circumstances and despite painful situations that might lead to despair, that something good is around the corner. It means we have a reason to dance, even in the rain. And you see, precisely because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we are now able to face our tough days with hope and with courage. For as one Christian author says so well, Christ's resurrection means the worst thing is never the last thing. Christ's resurrection means the worst thing is never the last thing. You see, Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega. Not only the beginning, but also the end, the joyful conclusion. And so today, as we peer into that empty tomb, like the early disciples did, we won't find Jesus' dead body. Instead, what we find there is our hope. For as the angel said, "Don't be afraid. I know you're looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is near. He is risen from the dead, just as he said would happen." And so just like that first Easter, for us today is a new day that should be filled with hope. And we can know that our lives no longer have to be waiting for the storm to pass, because now we can dance, even in the rain. For he is risen from the dead, and so will we. So you see, now it's our time to dance. So let's dance. Happy Easter.